What does it take to shake the very foundations of politics? Is it decades of experience, connections with powerful elites, or endless resources? Not if you are Hana Clarke, a 22-year-old New Zealand MP who's making history, not with words but with action. Her protest against a controversial bill, using the powerful Ka Mate Haka, has not only disrupted her parliament but also caught the attention of the world, especially in Africa. Now, why does a story about New Zealand resonate so deeply in Africa? It's simple. The fight is the same. Indigenous people in both places are grappling with the legacies of colonialism, systemic exploitation, and erasure of identity. The difference? While Clarke boldly stands for her people, too many African leaders sit idly by, failing to address the struggles of their own. But there's something larger at play here. This isn't just about a bill or a protest. It's about a young leader taking a stand that many older, seasoned politicians wouldn't dare. How did it come to this? Let's find out. Let's rewind a little to understand what led to this protest that has taken the internet by storm. The year is 1840. The British Empire, at the height of its colonial expansion, is eager to solidify its foothold in New Zealand. British settlers are arriving in droves, and tension is simmering between them and the Maori, the indigenous people who have lived on the islands for centuries. The Maori are deeply connected to their land, physically, spiritually, and culturally. To them, land isn't just a commodity, it's an extension of their ancestors, a sacred inheritance that binds past, present, and future. The British Crown, aware that open conflict could jeopardize its ambitions, proposed the Treaty of Waitangi. It's pitched as a win-win. Maori chiefs would retain ownership of their land and gain the Crown's protection, while the British would be allowed to settle and govern. In theory, the treaty would establish a partnership based on mutual respect and shared sovereignty. But here's the catch. There were two versions of the treaty, one in English and one in Maori. The English version granted the British Crown sovereignty over New Zealand, effectively making it the supreme authority. The Maori version, however, used the term Tinö Rangatira Tanga, which is closer to absolute chieftainship or autonomy. To the Maori chiefs who signed the treaty, this implied they would retain control over their lands, resources, and people while allying with the British. The result? A catastrophic misunderstanding, or more accurately, a calculated deception. The Maori believed they were forging a partnership. The British treated it as a transfer of power. Almost immediately, the Crown began to exploit the ambiguity. In the decades that followed, the promises of the treaty unraveled. British settlers, hungry for land, pushed the Crown to confiscate Maori territories. Wars broke out as Maori tribes resisted, but they were no match for British military might. By the late 19th century, laws like the New Zealand Settlements Act of 1863 legalized the seizure of rebel lands, stripping Maori of millions of acres. Entire communities were uprooted, and traditional ways of life were destroyed. The cultural impact was equally devastating. Maori language and customs were suppressed as the government pursued a policy of assimilation. Schools punished children for speaking their native tongue, and Maori spirituality was dismissed as primitive. What was once a thriving, self-sustaining culture became marginalized and disenfranchised. By the end of the 19th century, Maori landholdings had plummeted to less than 10% of their original extent. Generations grew up disconnected from their heritage, forced to adapt to a society that treated them as second-class citizens. Efforts to reclaim what was lost began in earnest in the 20th century, but progress has been slow and fraught with challenges. Now, fast forward to today. The proposed bill that Hana Clarke protested sought to weaken protections for Maori land, making it easier for developers and corporations to exploit those territories. For the Maori, this wasn't just another piece of legislation. It was a continuation of the colonial pattern of erasure and exploitation that had begun nearly 2 centuries ago. This is why Clarke's protest struck such a powerful chord. She wasn't just opposing a bill, she was standing against an entire system built on broken promises. Her actions reminded everyone, politicians, activists, and citizens alike, that the Treaty of Waitangi is not just a historical artifact. It's a living document whose promises, though repeatedly violated, still hold the potential for justice and reconciliation. But to truly understand the weight of her protest, we need to look beyond the treaty itself and explore how its betrayals echo in the lives of Maori people today. It's not just history, it's the present, and it's urgent. But why did Hana Clarke use the haka to protest? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The Kamat Haka isn't just a dance. It's a story, a declaration, and a weapon all rolled into one. Its origins trace back to Te Rauparaha, a legendary Maori chief who narrowly escaped his enemies by seeking refuge in a subterranean kumara, or sweet potato pit. Upon emerging unscathed, he composed the Kameti Haka as a celebration of survival and triumph over death. Its iconic chant translates to, "It is death, it is death, it is life, it is life," a proclamation of resilience and victory against insurmountable odds. For the Maori, the haka holds a significance that goes far beyond its dramatic movements or stirring chants. It is a deeply spiritual expression of identity, pride, and resistance. Traditionally, it was performed before battles, where warriors would use rhythmic stomping, chanting, and gestures to summon strength, intimidate their enemies, and affirm their unity. But the haka is also woven into Maori cultural life, performed at funerals to honor the departed, at weddings to celebrate the union, and at protests to assert justice and survival. So when Hana Rauhiri stood in Parliament and performed the Ka Mate Haka, it wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an act of reclamation. She wasn't just addressing her fellow MPs, she was summoning the spirits of her ancestors, drawing strength from centuries of resistance to declare, "We are still here, and we will not be silenced." Her movements, her voice, and her unflinching presence carried the weight of history and a message that couldn't be ignored. This act wasn't merely symbolic, it was profoundly disruptive. Parliamentary debates are often dominated by rehearsed speeches and rigid decorum, but Clarke's haka shattered that norm. The rhythm of her feet on the floor, the power in her voice, and the intensity of her gaze created an atmosphere no speech or debate could replicate. It was impossible to look away. Her protest halted parliamentary proceedings, delayed the vote, and thrust the Maori struggle back into the national conversation in a way that demanded attention.
Opposed.
But what makes the haka so powerful isn't just its cultural significance in New Zealand, it's its universality. The haka's message of defiance and resilience transcends borders. Across the globe, indigenous and oppressed communities have used cultural expressions to resist domination. In Africa, for instance, traditional dances and songs were critical tools of liberation movements. The Zulu Ndlamu dance was performed to bolster morale before battle, while freedom songs during South Africa's apartheid era became rallying cries for justice and equality. The parallels are undeniable. The haka, like these African traditions, isn't just an art form, it's a language of resistance. Its physicality and energy convey a defiance that words often cannot. When Clarke performed the Ka Mate Haka, she connected with anyone who has ever fought for their identity, their land, or their survival. Her choice of the haka also challenged a pervasive misconception that Maori culture, like many indigenous traditions, is static or relegated to the past. By bringing the haka into the halls of modern governance, she reminded her audience that Maori identity is living, evolving, and inseparable from the nation's future. This wasn't about nostalgia, it was about asserting that indigenous traditions have a rightful place in shaping contemporary politics. But there's another layer to her protest. It wasn't just about the Maori. By choosing the haka, Clarke made a statement that resonates globally, particularly with communities that have experienced colonization. The chant is a universal cry of survival against all odds, a message that speaks to anyone who has ever been underestimated or oppressed. Ultimately, Clarke's decision to use the haka wasn't just an act of defiance. It was a masterstroke of cultural and political strategy. It reminded New Zealand, and the world, that the fight for Indigenous rights is far from over. And in doing so, it inspired others to recognize the power of their cultural traditions in the ongoing battle for justice. So, what makes Hana Clarke's protest so groundbreaking? In politics, boldness is often a luxury. Most leaders tiptoe around sensitive issues, fearing backlash or loss of support. But Hana didn't just break the mold, she smashed it. Her protest wasn't pre-approved or sanitized for public consumption. It was raw, unfiltered, and unapologetically confrontational. For starters, her choice to use the haka wasn't just innovative, it was risky. New Zealand's parliament is a space steeped in formality and tradition, where such an act could easily be dismissed as inappropriate or disrespectful. Yet, by performing the haka, Clarke reclaimed that space, reminding her peers that Maori voices cannot be excluded from decisions that affect them. Her protest also struck a nerve globally. It's one thing to give a speech about Indigenous rights, it's another to embody those rights through an act that carries the weight of history and culture. Clarke's haka wasn't just seen, it was felt. Social media erupted with reactions, and her action sparked conversations far beyond New Zealand. But perhaps the most groundbreaking aspect of her protest was its ability to bridge generational and cultural divides. While her immediate audience was New Zealand's parliament, her message resonated with young activists worldwide, particularly in Africa. Why? Because Clarke's fight is their fight, and in her courage, they saw a reflection of what leadership could, and should, look like. This begs the question: how do Maori's and Africa's stories look alike? At first glance, New Zealand and Africa couldn't seem more different. One is a small island nation in the Pacific, the other a vast continent with 54 countries and countless cultures. Yet, beneath the surface lies a striking similarity. Both the Maori of New Zealand and the peoples of Africa share a history marked by colonization, land dispossession, cultural suppression, and the enduring fight to reclaim their identities. The Maori story and Africa's history mirror each other because they were written from the same colonial playbook. Both were targeted by empires that sought to expand their territories, extract resources, and impose their cultural systems on the indigenous populations. In New Zealand, the British Crown framed the Treaty of Waitangi as a partnership, but it quickly became a tool to seize land and authority. In Africa, colonial powers used treaties, wars, and outright deceit to achieve the same goal. Take the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. European nations convened at the Berlin Conference in 1884 to divide the continent among themselves, carving up territories with no regard for the people who lived there. Just as Maori chiefs were misled into signing a treaty that eroded their sovereignty, African leaders were coerced or tricked into agreements that handed over control of their lands and resources. The results were devastating. Entire communities were displaced, cultural practices outlawed, and economies were restructured to serve colonial interests. For both the Maori and Africans, land isn't just property, it's life. It's the foundation of their economies, the anchor of their cultural traditions, and a spiritual connection to their ancestors. Losing land meant losing not only their livelihoods, but also their sense of identity. In New Zealand, the confiscation of Maori land was justified under laws like the New Zealand Settlements Act of 1863, which allowed the Crown to seize land from Maori deemed rebels. Similarly, in Africa, colonial powers passed laws to legalize land grabs. The British in Kenya introduced the Crown Lands Ordinance, which declared all unoccupied land as property of the British Crown, forcing native Kenyans into reserves and opening up fertile areas for European settlers. The dispossession of land in both regions wasn't just a physical loss, it was an assault on the very fabric of their societies. For the Maori, the loss of land disrupted communal living and their connection to Whenua, the earth. For Africans, it dismantled traditional systems of governance and led to economic disenfranchisement that persists today. Another parallel lies in the suppression of indigenous cultures. Both the Maori and African peoples endured deliberate efforts to erase their identities. In New Zealand, Maori children were punished for speaking their language in schools, and Maori spiritual practices were dismissed as pagan. Similarly, in Africa, colonial powers sought to replace native languages, religions, and customs with European equivalents. Missionaries often portrayed African spirituality as barbaric, and indigenous governance systems were sidelined in favor of Western-style administrations. In both cases, this cultural suppression wasn't incidental. It was a calculated move to break the spirit of the people and make them easier to control. Yet despite these efforts, both the Maori and Africans have shown remarkable resilience. Their languages, traditions, and beliefs have survived and are now being reclaimed and celebrated. Resistance is another thread that ties the Maori and Africa together. Both have long histories of standing up against oppression, often at great personal and collective cost. For the Maori, resistance began almost immediately after the Treaty of Waitangi was signed. Leaders like Te Kuri and Wiremu Hana led uprisings against land confiscations and fought to preserve Maori autonomy. Similarly, Africa's resistance movements have taken many forms, from armed struggles like the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya to nonviolent movements led by figures like Nelson Mandela. What's striking is how both groups use their cultural traditions as tools of resistance. The Maori haka, with its powerful symbolism and physicality, became a way to assert identity and defy oppression. In Africa, traditional dances, songs, and rituals were used to unite communities and galvanize support for liberation movements. Today, the Maori and African peoples are still dealing with the legacies of colonization. Economic inequality, political marginalization, and social challenges remain persistent issues. In New Zealand, the Maori face disparities in health, education, and income, stemming from the systemic discrimination of the colonial era. In Africa, many nations are still grappling with the economic structures left behind by colonial powers, which prioritize resource extraction over development. But what makes these stories so compelling is the resilience and resurgence of these communities. The Maori have fought tirelessly to reclaim their language, culture, and land, achieving milestones like the Waitangi Tribunal and the recognition of Maori as an official language. In Africa, there is a growing movement to reclaim indigenous knowledge systems, revive traditional governance structures, and assert control over resources. The parallels between the Maori and Africa aren't just historical, they're deeply emotional and cultural. Both have had to fight to preserve their identities in the face of relentless efforts to erase them. And that fight has created a bond, even if unspoken, between these communities. When Hana Clarke stood in Parliament and performed the Kamate Haka, it wasn't just a Maori statement. It was a universal call to action for all oppressed peoples. Her actions resonated in Africa because they mirrored the struggles and triumphs that Africans know all too well. It's a reminder that the fight for justice and identity is not confined to one place or one person. It's a shared journey that unites communities across the globe. Her story has sparked a movement, inspiring young Africans to demand more from their leaders. But it has also raised uncomfortable questions. If a 22-year-old in New Zealand can take a stand, why are so many seasoned African politicians falling short? Let's not beat around the bush. African leaders have a problem. While some have shown courage and vision, too many have succumbed to the trappings of power, choosing personal gain over public good. Take the infamous corruption scandals in Nigeria's oil sector, where billions have vanished into private pockets, or South Africa's state capture debacle, which drained the nation's coffers and eroded public trust. These aren't just failures, they're betrayals. In contrast, Hana Rapidi's actions are a masterclass in integrity. She didn't wait for someone else to take a stand. She didn't calculate the political risks. She simply acted, driven by a deep sense of responsibility to her people. And that's the kind of leadership Africa desperately needs. But Clarke's story isn't just a critique, it's a challenge. It's a reminder that leadership isn't about titles or experience, it's about courage. And for Africa, it's a wake-up call. Will its leaders rise to the occasion, or will they continue to be outshone by a 22-year-old from New Zealand? Hana Clarke has done more than make headlines. She's lit a spark. Her story is proof that leadership doesn't have to be synonymous with compromise or complacency. It can be bold, it can be principled, and it can inspire. For young people worldwide, Clarke's protest is a rallying cry. It's a reminder that they don't have to wait for permission to lead. They can take the reins, challenge the status quo, and demand better. In Africa, where the median age is under 20, her story resonates deeply. If she can stand up to an entire political system at 22, why can't Africa's youth do the same? The future doesn't belong to the complacent or the corrupt. It belongs to the brave, the bold, and the fearless. And as Hana Clarke has shown, sometimes all it takes is one act of defiance to change the world. Do you think it is the time for not just Africa, but the whole world to stand against Western oppression? Will these protests save them? Let us know in the comment section. Why is the years of colonialization still not ending? Is it our fault? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.